This letter was never sent. Not because it was lost. Not because it was stolen. But because by the time the final word was written, Princess Elara was no longer alive to send it. For 300 years, it sat sealed inside a stone box beneath the floor of a forgotten chapel, untouched, unread, waiting. When it was finally discovered, historians wept as they read it, because it wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, an apology, and a goodbye, all written by a girl who knew she was going to die before her mother ever found out the truth. Imagine spending the last hours of your life writing to the one person you were too afraid to be honest with while you still had the chance. Now imagine that person never even knowing it existed. What was in that letter? Why did a princess, born into wealth and power, spend her final hours writing to a mother who may never read her words? And more importantly, if you had only one night left, is there someone you'd finally tell the truth to? Keep watching because this story will break your heart, and by the end, you'll understand exactly why this letter still matters today. In the kingdom of Ashvale, nestled between snow-capped mountains and a restless gray sea, Princess Elara was born as the only daughter of Queen Miriam. From the outside, their bond looked unbreakable. The queen doted on her daughter, personally teaching her how to read the stars, how to speak to servants with kindness, and how to carry herself like someone who belonged to no one but herself. But behind palace walls, the kingdom was crumbling. Ashvale had been at war with the neighboring kingdom of Draymore for nearly a decade, and the royal treasury was bleeding dry. Advisors whispered that the only way to end the bloodshed was through marriage, Elara's marriage, to Draymore's crown prince, a man twice her age, known more for his temper than his kindness. Queen Miriam resisted the idea for years. She had once been forced into a political marriage herself, and she swore her daughter would never suffer the same fate. But as the war dragged on and soldiers kept dying, the council grew desperate. Whispers turned into demands. And slowly, even the queen's resolve began to waver under the weight of a kingdom that needed saving. Elara noticed the change in her mother before anyone told her the truth. She noticed the sleepless nights, the closed-door meetings, the way her mother's smile no longer reached her eyes. It was in this quiet, growing distance that the seeds of the letter were planted, long before Elara ever picked up a pen. Ashvale itself was a kingdom of contrasts. Its capital city gleamed with white stone towers and gardens that bloomed even in winter, thanks to the royal greenhouses Queen Miriam had built early in her reign. But just beyond the capital's walls, the villages closest to the Draymore border told a different story: burned fields, empty granaries, and families who had buried more sons than they could count. Elara grew up seeing both sides of her kingdom: the polished ballrooms where nobles danced without a care, and the refugee camps where children her own age had already forgotten what peace looked like. It was this contrast that shaped who Elara became. Unlike many nobles who were sheltered from the realities of war, Elara insisted on visiting the border towns whenever she could, often against her mother's wishes. She would bring bread, blankets, and medicine, sitting with families for hours, listening to stories of loss that no palace history book ever recorded. These visits gave her a perspective most princesses never had. She understood, better than anyone in the court, exactly what was at stake if the war continued. This is partly why, when the idea of a political marriage to end the war first surfaced, Elara didn't immediately reject it out of vanity or fear. Her hesitation came from something deeper: the quiet, aching question of whether her own happiness was allowed to matter at all when so many people were suffering. It was a question she wrestled with silently for months, never quite finding an answer she could live with. To understand why this letter carries so much weight, you have to understand the relationship between Elara and her mother, because it wasn't simple. It was layered, complicated, and deeply human. When Elara was young, her mother would sneak into her chambers late at night, long after the guards had changed shifts, just to tell her stories about the sea. She used to say, "The sea doesn't ask permission to be free, Elara. Neither should you." Those words stayed with her for the rest of her life. But as Elara grew older, the warmth between them began competing with duty. Queen Miriam had to be a ruler first and a mother second, a truth that hurt them both, even if neither ever said it aloud. Elara remembered the exact night things started to shift. She was 14, sitting by the window of her chambers, when she overheard her mother arguing with the head of the council. The word sacrifice came up more than once.
She didn't understand it then.
She would understand it far too well later. As the years passed, the war worsened. Villages near the border were burned. Refugees flooded into the capital. Soldiers Elara had grown up admiring returned home in coffins instead of on horseback. She began attending council meetings in secret, standing behind pillars, listening to grown men decide the fate of a kingdom and, increasingly, the fate of her own life. It was during one of these meetings that she first heard Draymore's terms clearly: peace, in exchange for her hand in marriage. She remembers gripping the cold stone pillar so hard her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream. Instead, she said nothing, because saying something would mean admitting she had been listening, and admitting she had been listening would break the fragile trust she still had with her mother. The betrayal Elara felt wasn't really about the marriage. It was about silence. Her mother, the woman who taught her to be free like the sea, was now the same woman negotiating away her freedom behind closed doors and hiding it from her. In the weeks that followed, Elara began keeping a small journal of her own, separate from the letter she would eventually write. In it, she documented her feelings in fragments: anger one day, understanding the next, grief mixed with something close to acceptance by the third. Reading those journal entries centuries later, historians noted how quickly her emotions shifted, almost as if she were trying to talk herself into forgiving her mother before the anger even had time to fully take root. One entry simply read, "I want to hate her.
I don't know how."
She also began spending more time with the palace's old librarian, a quiet man named Bertrand who had served 3 generations of Ashvale's royal family. He told her stories of queens before her mother, women who had also been forced into political marriages, some who found happiness despite it, others who never did. Elara clung to these stories, searching for some proof that her fate wasn't already sealed in tragedy. Bertrand, sensing her fear, once told her something she would remember for the rest of her short life. "A crown doesn't decide your heart, child. Only you can do that." Weeks turned into months. The council pressured the queen daily. Elara watched her mother age faster than time should have allowed, dark circles deepening under her eyes, her once steady hands beginning to tremble as she signed documents she clearly despised. And still, nothing was said between them. Not directly. Not honestly. Until the night everything changed. It was raining the night Elara finally confronted her mother. She walked into the queen's private study unannounced, drenched from the storm outside, and asked the question that had been eating her alive for months. "Are you going to sell me to end this war?" The silence that followed felt like it lasted a lifetime. Queen Miriam didn't deny it. She simply looked at her daughter with eyes full of grief and whispered, "I don't know how else to save our people." That night, something inside Elara broke, not out of hatred, but out of heartbreak. She understood, even then, that her mother wasn't a villain. She was a woman trapped by duty, just as Elara herself now felt trapped by blood. Queen Miriam reached for her daughter that night, but Elara stepped back, unable to bear being comforted by the very person who had caused the pain. "I needed you to tell me yourself," Elara said quietly, her voice trembling. "Not the council. Not the servants whispering in the halls. You." The queen had no defense for that. She simply nodded, tears finally slipping down her face, and admitted that she had been trying to protect Elara from the weight of the decision for as long as she possibly could, even if that meant carrying the guilt alone. In the days that followed, mother and daughter existed in a strange, painful limbo. They still shared meals, still exchanged polite conversation in front of the court, but the easy warmth that once defined their relationship had turned brittle, like ice about to crack. Servants noticed it. Advisors noticed it. Even the youngest kitchen staff whispered about how the palace, once filled with the sound of the queen and princess laughing together, had grown unbearably quiet. Elara began spending long hours alone by the sea cliffs just outside the palace walls, the same cliffs her mother used to take her to as a child. She would sit for hours, watching the waves crash against the rocks, thinking about freedom, duty, and the impossible space in between. It was during one of these solitary visits that she first began to accept, quietly and privately, that she might go through with a marriage, not out of surrender, but out of love for a kingdom and a mother she still couldn't bring herself to hate. If this story is pulling at your heart already, hit that like button right now. It helps the story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's get to the moment everything changes. 3 days before she was set to leave for Draymore, Elara fell gravely ill. It started as a simple fever, the kind healers dismissed as exhaustion from the stress of the upcoming journey. But within hours, her condition worsened. Her skin grew pale, her breathing shallow, and no remedy the royal physicians tried seemed to help. Rumors would later spread that she had been poisoned, perhaps by someone within Draymore's court who feared her arrival, or perhaps by someone inside Ashvale who wanted the wedding to fail. The truth was never confirmed. But Elara herself seemed to sense, somewhere deep inside, that she was not going to survive the week. It was in this fragile state, alone in her chambers with only candlelight and the sound of rain against her window, that she asked her handmaiden for parchment, ink, and privacy. Her handmaiden, a young woman named Sable who had served Elara since childhood, later recalled how strange the request felt. Elara had never been one for writing long letters. She preferred speaking her mind directly, often to a fault. But that night, something in her eyes had changed. Sable remembered thinking the princess looked less like a girl afraid of dying, and more like someone finally ready to say everything she had been holding back for months. She left the candle burning, closed the door softly, and stood guard outside, so no one would interrupt.
She began to write.
The first lines of the letter were shaky, both in handwriting and in tone. She wrote of forgiveness, not asking for it, but offering it. She told her mother that she understood, now more than ever, the impossible weight of ruling a kingdom while trying to protect the people you love. She wrote, "I used to think love and duty were enemies, Mother. I understand now that you have spent your whole life trying to make peace between them, and I hate that I made it harder for you." As the night went on, her words grew more personal, more raw. She wrote about the stories of the sea her mother used to tell her, about how she used to fall asleep imagining herself as a wave, crashing wherever she pleased, answering to no one. She wrote that, even now, dying in a bed she never chose, she still felt free, because her mother had given her that gift long before the crown ever tried to take it away. She confessed her fears, too. She admitted that she was terrified, not of death, but of being forgotten, of becoming just another name in Ashvale's long, bloody history of political marriages and broken promises. She begged her mother not to let her story end there. "Let them remember me as someone who loved fiercely," she wrote, "not someone who was simply given away." There were moments in the letter where her handwriting became almost illegible, likely as her fever spiked and her strength faded. She apologized for the nights she had been cold and distant toward her mother, for the silent dinners, for the anger she had held onto instead of asking for the truth sooner. "We wasted so much time being careful with each other," she wrote, "when we should have simply been honest." She also wrote, almost as an aside, about the small things she would miss: the smell of salt water drifting through her window each morning, the sound of her mother humming an old lullaby while walking the palace gardens, and the way the kitchen staff always saved her the first warm loaf of bread on baking days. "It's strange," she wrote, "how it's never the grand things you think of in the end. It's the small, quiet ones, the ones you never thought to say thank you for." In one of the letter's most devastating passages, Elara wrote about a memory from when she was 7 years old. She had fallen from her horse during a hunting trip and broken her arm. Her mother, despite being queen, personally carried her back to the palace on foot, refusing to let any guard take her place. "You didn't have to do that," Elara wrote. "A queen doesn't have to hold her daughter's pain."
But you did.
"You always did. I only wish I had told you, back then, how much that meant to me." As dawn approached, her words shifted from memory to hope. She wrote about the kind of mother she believed Queen Miriam truly was beneath the crown, someone who loved deeply but had been taught, by circumstance and duty, to hide that love behind decisions that looked like betrayal but were, in truth, sacrifices. "You didn't choose to hurt me," she wrote. "You chose survival for all of us, even when it cost you your own heart." Near the final pages, her tone grew calmer, almost peaceful, as if she had made peace with what was coming. She wrote one last wish, not for herself, but for her mother. "When I'm gone, don't let guilt swallow you. Rule with the same strength you always have. And when you look at the sea, know that I'm somewhere in it, finally free." The final line of the letter was left unfinished. The ink trailed off mid-sentence, as though her hand simply could no longer hold the pen. Historians believe she passed away in the very early hours of the morning, alone, with the letter still resting beside her. When Elara's death was discovered, the palace fell into chaos. The wedding to Dramore's prince was immediately called off, not out of grief alone, but because both kingdoms feared the political scandal of a bride dying under mysterious circumstances just days before the ceremony. Ironically, the very marriage meant to prevent war may have ended it anyway. Dramore, embarrassed and wary of further conflict, agreed to a temporary truce shortly after news of her death spread. But the letter itself vanished from public knowledge almost instantly. According to palace records, it was Sable, the same handmaiden who had stood guard outside Elara's door that final night, who discovered the letter resting beside the princess's body the next morning. Grief-stricken and terrified of how the queen might react to its raw, unfiltered contents, Sable made the agonizing decision to hide it rather than deliver it. She later wrote in her own private diary, also discovered centuries later, that she feared the letter would either destroy the queen with guilt or be seized and altered by the council for political purposes, since Elara's words about the forced marriage could easily have been twisted into a scandal. So, in the dead of night, Sable carried the letter to the small private chapel the royal family rarely used, pried open a loose stone in the floor, and buried it inside a small iron box lined with cedar wood to protect it from moisture. She told no one, not even the queen, believing it was safer for the letter to disappear than to add fuel to Miriam's already unbearable grief. Sable carried that secret for the rest of her life, never once telling another soul what she had done, and the location of the letter died with her. Queen Miriam spent the rest of her life believing her daughter died angry with her, never knowing that Elara's final hours had been filled not with resentment, but with forgiveness. She ruled for another 12 years after Elara's death, her reign marked by unusual compassion, especially toward young women forced into political marriages, a policy shift many historians now believe was her quiet, grieving tribute to the daughter she lost. The letter remained hidden for centuries, sealed away by time, dust, and the slow decay of memory, until a restoration team working on the old chapel accidentally discovered the stone box beneath a cracked section of flooring. The lead archivist on the project later described the moment she first unfolded the brittle parchment as one of the most surreal experiences of her career. The handwriting, though faded, was still legible enough to translate, and as she read through the first few lines, she realized she wasn't looking at just another historical document. She was reading the private, unfiltered heart of a girl who had died believing her mother would never understand her. When historians carefully unsealed and translated the fragile parchment, cross-referencing it with palace records, royal correspondence, and Sable's own diary, they were able to piece together the full story for the first time in 300 years. News of the discovery spread quickly through academic circles and eventually to the public, sparking a renewed fascination with Ashvale's history, not for its wars or its politics, but for this single, deeply human moment between a mother and a daughter who never got the chance to say goodbye to each other's faces. There's something deeply human about Elara's letter that transcends the fact that she was a princess. Strip away the crown, the kingdom, and the war, and what remains is a story so many people can relate to: the fear of dying with things left unsaid, the desperate need to be understood by the people who raised us, and the painful realization that sometimes the people we're angriest at are the ones who love us the most. Elara's letter teaches us something painful but important. Forgiveness doesn't require the other person to be present. Sometimes, healing happens in solitude, in the quiet act of finally letting go of resentment, Even if the person we're forgiving will never know it happened. Queen Miriam never got to read those words in her daughter's lifetime, but the fact that Elara wrote them at all says everything about the kind of person she truly was, someone who chose love over bitterness, even in her final hours. It also forces us to ask a harder question. How many of us are carrying unspoken feelings toward people we love, waiting for the right time to say them? Elara didn't have the luxury of time. Most of us assume we do. Her story is a quiet, painful reminder to not make the same assumption. There's also something worth noting about Sable's decision to hide the letter. On the surface, it might look like a betrayal, a broken promise to deliver a dying girl's final words. But look closer, and it becomes an act of profound love in its own right. Sable made an impossible choice, trying to protect a grieving mother from words she feared might break her completely. It wasn't the right choice, perhaps, but it was a deeply human one, born from the same instinct that makes all of us want to shield the people we love from unbearable pain, even when honesty might have served them better in the long run. Queen Miriam, for her part, spent her remaining years quietly transforming her grief into policy. Records show that within a year of Elara's death, she abolished several long-standing traditions that forced young noblewomen into marriages purely for political gain, replacing them with new laws that required a woman's explicit consent before any royal betrothal could be finalized. Scholars have long debated whether this was a coincidence or a direct response to her daughter's death, but given the timing, most agree it was almost certainly the latter, a quiet, unspoken tribute from a mother who never got to read her daughter's forgiveness, but somehow acted as though she already knew it existed. Perhaps that's the most bittersweet part of this entire story. Even without ever reading the letter, Queen Miriam spent her life ruling with more compassion, more caution, and more heart than she had before her daughter's death, almost as if some part of Elara's love had reached her anyway, carried not by parchment and ink, but by memory, grief, and the quiet echo of everything they never got to say to each other while there was still time. Today, the letter is preserved behind protective glass in Asheville's Royal Museum, translated into dozens of languages, studied by historians and read by millions who have never set foot anywhere near the kingdom it came from. And yet, its message remains timeless, transcending centuries, borders, and even the fact that it was written by a princess rather than an ordinary girl. At its core, it's simply the story of a daughter trying to tell her mother, one final time, that despite everything, she was loved, and that love, even when buried for 300 years, never truly disappears. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We bring you emotional, powerful stories like this one every single week. Stories about love, loss, royalty, and the parts of history that never made it into textbooks. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Wherever you're watching this from, drop a comment down below and tell us which US state you're watching from tonight. It always amazes me seeing how far and wide this community stretches, and I genuinely love reading where all of you are tuning in from. So go ahead, let me know, which state are you in right now? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.